Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for tonight's book launch event with Pik-Shuen Fung and K-Ming Chang, celebrating the launch of Pik-Shuen's spectacular debut novel, Ghost Forest. My name is Lily Philpott. I'm the programs manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. Please let us know in the chat where you're watching from. I am speaking to you all from Brooklyn, New York, which is on ancestral and unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. For those of you who are new to the AAWW, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. At a time when these communities are specifically vulnerable, we continue to offer a space in which we can imagine a more just future. You can visit us at aaww.org or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. We are so thrilled to be working with so many friends and partners for this event. To begin with, we hope you'll support our friends at Books Are Magic. You can find a link to purchase signed copies of Ghost Forest and Bestiary in the chat, and you can support one of our favorite independent bookstores in doing so. Following Pik-Shuen and K-Ming's conversation, we invite you to stay online as we shift to a virtual after party, co-presented with our friends at Tables of Contents and Pecking House. Chef Eric Huang from Pecking House will join us for a live cooking demonstration of a recipe he created especially for this event. We hope you will stick around, grab a drink, and celebrate with us. During this event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged and the person will be removed from this event. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the hour. You can ask your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I am going to briefly introduce Pik-Shuen and K-Ming, and then I hope you will join me in welcoming them both on screen. Pik-Shuen Fung is a Canadian writer and artist living in New York City. She has received fellowships and residencies from the Asian American Writers Workshop, Kundiman, the Malay Colony, and Story Knife. She has an MFA in Fine Art from the School of Visual Arts and a BA from Brown University. Ghost Forest, which is out today, is her first book. K-Ming Chang is a Kundiman Fellow, a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. She is the author of the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice novel Bestiary, out from One World, along with Ghost Forest, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and the PEN Faulkner Award. Her short story collection, Gods of Want, is forthcoming from One World. Please join me in welcoming K-Ming and Pik-Shuen and enjoy the evening.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, all. I just wanted to say I'm so honored to be here and to talk to you, Pik-Shuen, about your incredible novel, and to say to everyone in the chat, thank you for being here as well. Yeah, I'm just so honored. This book has such compassion toward its characters, and I can't wait to ask you all the questions. And of course, as we speak, if anyone in the audience as well has a question, feel free to use the question function as well. But without further ado, I'll leap into my first question, which is one of the many, many incredible things about this book is how many voices are contained in it and the presence of oral histories throughout the novel, especially focusing on matrilineage and the generations of women and their stories, what they carry and what they choose to tell each other. And it kind of made me think of one particular vignette that comes later in the book, where the narrator does research on an ink bamboo painter named Guan Dongshen, whose husband's work is collected and archived all over the world, whereas a lot of her work has been kind of lost. And it made me think a lot about how, in contrast to that, this book is kind of recovering the matriline, it extends all the way to great-great-grandmothers. And so I just wanted to ask you, what was it like writing these oral history sections and developing the voices of these women? And did you always know that these oral history sections were going to be part of the book?
Yeah, it was really fun to write that part of the book with the voices of the grandmother and the mother. I think that what I wanted to do was to write these women who are funny, intelligent, creative, and be able to capture how amazing and talented they are. Like the mother is a really talented basketball player in her youth, and the grandmother wrote and performed her own Cantonese operas. So for me, it was just really like a fun part of the process to incorporate their voices. And it didn't come in the beginning. Like in the beginning, I had written the father daughter storyline, and it was only a few years in that I actually incorporated the stories of the mother and grandmother.
Mm. That's so beautiful to me. I think what you said, what you're saying too, about showing all these facets of who they were as children too, and who they were growing up. It also makes me think of that section where the mother talks about why she took the narrator to art classes, and this desire of like, I want you to be able to do what you want to do. I don't know. It's just that was so beautiful and powerful. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think another, I think deeply resonant thing about the book for me, and is also about how the women interact with each other too, is thinking about like what they choose to tell and not tell each other as a way of loving. So in many vignettes throughout the book, there are instances in which the mother or grandmother choose not to say or tell something in order to kind of spare the narrator in some way, like the narrator's mother not wanting the narrator to visit her ailing grandfather and telling her, oh, don't worry about it. Or even later when the mother tells the narrator about what she faced raising her two daughters and said, that's why I didn't want to tell you. I knew you would get upset. I mean, I had never really read about this particular dynamic before, but it really resonated with me, that idea of not saying something as also a form of love. But we also see throughout the book that the narrator is asking these questions and does want to know their stories, and that her desire to know is also a form of love. So I just wanted to know, how did you approach the spoken and the unspoken throughout the book? And since the book emphasizes a lot the idea of asking the questions we don't know how to ask, how did you arrive to those questions?
Wow. I mean, I think it's so beautiful the way you just described it, that not not speaking and knowing are both forms of love, because I didn't even think about that until until you just worded it that way. I think that thinking about like what is unsaid in a family was really important to me, especially in my experience growing up in my Chinese family. There are so many things that we didn't talk about, especially emotionally, or in terms of trauma or death. Like any of those things, we just not speak about, because partly we don't want our family members to worry. And yeah, I guess that is a form of love. And also for this narrator, wanting to understand and know what her parents and grandparents experienced, and how they feel, and what they're thinking about, that was also important, because this narrator grew up in Canada and grew up in a different culture. And um, that's, I mean, I just think it's so beautiful that you describe that as another form of love. Um, yeah, what was the second part of your question?
Oh no, it was just, yeah, how it was just about, I think you answered it, about how the narrator kind of arrives to asking these questions. But I think, yeah, I think you pretty much answered it.
Yeah,
But yeah,
actually,
oh yeah,
I'd like to add to that part,
yes.
because I feel like for so many of us, when we're young, the way that we see our parents and grandparents, it's like they didn't have lives before we were born. Like,
Yeah.
and so for this narrator, like she just asked some really simple questions, like, what was your childhood like? And what were your parents like? These questions that I didn't think to ask when I was young. And it's only when I'm getting older and I see, you know, some of my friends are starting to have kids, like, oh yeah, like my parents and grandparents had full lives before I came into this world.
Yeah, I love that so much because I think you're right. There is a kind of narrative of the way we look at caretaking figures as like kind of being purely sacrificial or only good because they sacrifice and like what have they done for us versus asking the questions of like what was it like for you, which I think is what this book does so beautifully. And also what you were saying about what's spoken and unspoken, that kind of transitions into another thing that I wanted to ask about, which is that there are so many, I don't know, it feels like different and untranslatable ways of expressing and articulating love. Like throughout this book, there are so many ways that the characters express care for each other. One of my favorite vignettes is about the fax machine healing. I don't know if it's like a spoiler for everyone to hear, but anyway, and just like there are also kind of conflicts and misunderstandings between the characters too over these kinds of love, with the narrator more focused on what it means to actually articulate "I love you" and kind of experimenting with that with the family, and whereas like the father would be like, "Oh, we don't have time to think about those things," and so I wondered, what was it like to write about these types of love and care within this family? And what drew you to write about the complexities of the narrator kind of grappling with that question of what it means to say, I love you? Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny because when I first started writing this book, and for a few years in, I thought I was just writing this book about grief and death. And I don't think I realized until much further in that I'm also writing a book about love, and
Mm,
that grief and love are totally intertwined. I think that for the older generations in the book, like so much of love is shown through acts and um, food and sacrifice.
mm,
There's no need to say it, especially in Chinese families, in my experience, because it's kind of like it's just understood.
mm,
Um, but then for this narrator, because she grows up in Canada and that's the culture that she's like seen her most of her life, she also really wants to hear it and she wants to say it, and so part of it was just like trying to capture this experience of this narrator who has been shown all of these different forms of love
mm.
uh, growing up, but she still feels like she needs like a different um, she still wants to hear it in a different love language.
Wow. Yeah, I really loved what yeah, I was like, oh, love languages. Oh no, I'm pulling us into love languages. But no, that's so beautiful. And I think it is really interesting yeah, to think about like the ways all the characters express love. And I mean, I guess this is, I don't know if maybe this is a bit of an abrupt transition, but I am really interested in how cohesive these vignettes form in or feel in many ways, and kind of probing at really similar questions throughout. But at the same time, like the way we enter the vignette is often through a kind of unexpected angle. Like one thing I really love is how these vignettes are linked not only thematically but by like colors. For example, like the green of jade will come back with like a green carpet in another vignette, and how there are just these images and resonances and connections between the vignettes that you link in these like small, minute ways, and not only in these kind of big thematic ways. So yeah, I love to hear how you built those connections between vignettes and how you found an order for the book.
This is a really good question. I definitely knew early on that I wanted to incorporate certain colors, especially green, and there's also yellow and brown. Probably because of my background as a painter, I just wanted this experience not to like overtly talk about the colors, but that I just, you know, have flashes of these colors throughout the book. kind of like impressions of these colors.
Mm.
And yeah, I talked to my editor, Nicole Counts, about that a lot. And as for the images that recur, I didn't actually know that I was doing that until you came in, pointed it out. You're like, oh, there's rhyming images. That I think was just completely out of my subconscious. And for me, like the ordering of the vignettes just came from a completely intuitive place, because I would print them out on like 4 per page and then cut them into tiny pieces of paper. And then I would lay them on my floor and just like rearrange them. Like over the 7 years that it took to make this book happen, I rearranged them on my floor so many times. And a lot of times it was just this gut feeling of like, oh, like this one looks better here, or this one feels better here. Kind of like when I'm painting, if I just put a brushstroke on the canvas and I'm like, oh, like that looks good, or that doesn't look good. It wasn't like a rational process. It was just this intuitive kind of logic.
That is so fascinating to hear about, and also so interesting because one of the very first things that I noticed in the beginning of the book are those kind of rhyming images that were subconscious for you, like the image of flight, we get the bird, and then right afterwards you get a vignette about a baby sun flying away, and then after that we get an astronaut, and it was like flight, flight, flight. Brilliant, like so incredible. So it's really amazing to hear how that is kind of buried from your intention, but that it comes out in the writing in that way. I'm also really love this idea of like 7 years of shuffling, a ghost forest process. And I'm really interested. I mean, you probably get asked this a lot, but because visual arts is really important to this book, and one of the lines that a lot of the blurbs of this book highlighted the idea of how absence is a kind of presence, and one line can draw the ocean, which is something that's mentioned in the vignette. I would love to hear about how, painting and visual arts influenced the writing of this book, whether your writing feels like an extension of your visual arts process or if it's something completely different for you. And if you had any, I don't know, pieces of artwork that were references for you while you were writing. Sorry, that was a lot of questions. You can, any one of those.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I painted for many years. I studied painting in high school and college, and I went to grad school at the School of Visual Arts. So it feels like such a big part of my identity. But I never really found my voice as an artist. And when I was in grad school, I started to question why I was painting, and I would sit in my studio and just like wonder like, oh, do I want to be a painter still? Like, what kind of art do I want to make? What kind of artist do I want to become in the long term? And I never really figured it out in visual art, but I started experimenting with all these different mediums. Like I tried some soft sculpture, and but I like really didn't like working with my hands. Like I tried baking one time and it was so repetitive. I like drank a bunch of coffee and I was like, I cannot, this is not sustainable for me. And I tried video. And then in the summer between my first and second years, my dad passed away, and I was in this space of grief. And I was reading short stories by Alice Munro. And one day I felt inspired to sit down and write out a vignette, just like a very short one from beginning to end. And the experience was so satisfying for me. I feel like in visual art, there are so many things that artists have to think about, like what's the lighting going to be? Like, where are you going to hang the artwork? Are you going to hang the artwork? Is it going to be large, small, like all these things that have to do with like the installation that somehow I really struggled with. Whereas when I started writing, I felt like I had so much more freedom and so much more control at the same time. It just felt like I finally found this medium that I'd been searching for. So I wrote more and more of these vignettes, and eventually they accumulated over years into this book. But yeah, I also want to share that like during that time, because I got so many rejections for like early versions of the manuscript, I spent like a lot of time regretting that I didn't realize I wanted to be a writer earlier. Like, oh my God, like I even went to my master's for visual art, and that's where I realized I wanted to write. But also, like, I had never seen, I didn't know any writers growing up. I didn't know that it could be a career. But now that I've done it, I feel like all of the things that I learned as an artist, they've just come with me into my writing, and like the way that I work, the way that I like react intuitively to like the placement of the vignettes and the layering of them. I feel like all of that comes from my art background. So that's been like a really big realization for me, that like, oh, it's not like I wasted all this time.
Yeah.
And it's not like there was a point when I was like, oh, I can't believe I'm trying to change careers at the age of 30. Like I'm so behind. But now it's like, oh my God, imagine if I hadn't tried, because I wasn't, it's like not like 30 was that old. um, so I feel like it's just been a really big realization for me that like in the creative process, like nothing important is ever lost, and everything just comes with me um, as like the foundation for my next work.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I feel too, that I feel like your relationship to text and to space on the page is so kind of a unique amalgamation of all of your experiences as a visual artist of going on this journey. And so I'm so surprised to hear that you would ever feel that in some ways you just hadn't, that somehow your visual arts background was like kind of a hindrance, or that you should have known earlier. Like, I just, yeah, I feel like it's so integrated in you in a way that is really beautiful. And also, speaking of, I remember I have encountered your visual art in the form of like videos, video art with captions, or with kind of like playing with the subtitle as a form of text in video. And I think that was even illuminating for me as I was reading this as well. Yeah, thinking of like what is kind of, translatable between people. And also, I feel like the relationship between the titles of your vignettes and the vignettes themselves is a very like art, I don't know, visual art influenced way of titling. At least I feel that way. Like I could almost imagine each of these titles being like a painting title. I think there's just such an interesting relationship between the titles and the vignettes. And I just wanted to hear like what was behind your decision in titling every single vignette, and like was that always were they always titled vignettes, and how did you find the titles for your vignettes as well?
Yeah, they had titles in the very beginning. The form that the vignettes are published in now are like the same form that I began with in 2014. But there were years in between when I um, was getting all those rejections, and I thought that I could never publish the book in this way, where I reformatted the entire book um, into these short vignettes linked by asterisks, and I removed all the titles. Um, but I ended up realizing that the titles, in a way, yeah, they add like a different layer. And also, I felt like I hoped that the title would kind of show the reader this is sort of a complete little vignette that you're about to read. It's not like a cascade of things that you're about to read. And as for choosing the titles, they were kind of random in the beginning. It was just like this decision. Some of them felt really right. Some of them I changed many times. Yeah, I think in the end it was just kind of like a frame to put the vignette in.
Yeah, I was about to say it is like a kind of framing because I think that other format that is more like all the vignettes kind of follow one after another in a more scrolling fashion doesn't quite give that frame to each vignette. Yeah, I think that's really true. Yeah, and this is slightly going back to something that you said that I'm still thinking about. So I hope it's okay that I'm asking this now, which is before we started talking about visual arts and finding the form of this. You mentioned not knowing that you were writing a book about love, that you thought you were writing this book about grief. And that's one of the things I admire so much about this book is that it kind of gives a different entry into thinking about grief and narratives about grief as well. And also how funny it is that grief and humor are always really entwined, and that in the most kind of the scenes that are very, very funny are also the scenes that feel full of grief at the same time. And so I was just wondering, yeah, how did you approach this humor that that you weave throughout the book? And was it something that kind of came naturally? Yeah.
It was really important for me, even though it's a book about grief, that it felt very light and spacious, kind of as like to have a sense of balance. Um, but also, I think that, yeah, I just feel like sometimes in the most difficult moments or like the saddest moments, there are some like absurd types of humor that can be found. And I wanted to capture the complexity of the experience. And if, if I was looking at a scene, if I looked at it from multiple angles, what are some of the things that would be funny about this scene, even though it's like also potentially very sad at the same time.
That's so beautiful to think about. And yeah, I think what you were saying about like many ways of approaching the scene, like it also makes me think of vignettes. Like there's this one vignette where the narrator talks about how the mother told a story about the narrator being born with a really hard head because of drinking herbal medicine, and it kind of ends with, okay, yes, you have this hard head, but at least it's not pointy. I mean, that's not the exact phrasing, but that's the general idea. And what I really love about that is, yeah, the spaciousness in that vignette and how it's almost formatted like a joke. It has like a punchline almost, but in this really kind of different and complicated way. And it has that spaciousness. And yeah, I was just thinking, like, as you were looking at these vignettes, were you thinking about the blank space and the white space between the lines? Were you thinking about the shape of the words on the page as well?
Yeah, because in the beginning of writing these vignettes, before I had decided to turn them into book, I was still in art school, and I needed a way to show the work in my studio. So I recorded myself reading the vignettes out loud as voiceover, and I paired them with some visuals of Chinese ink paintings to make some video art. And so I wasn't actually showing anyone what it looked like on the page, but I think maybe because of my background as a painter, I just really liked how it looked when the vignette was on its own page, surrounded by all this white space. And I think that because I wanted this feeling of spaciousness and also slowness, I decided ultimately to keep it in this form with lots of empty space on the page. Yeah.
Wow, I just like, oh, you're so brilliant. I'm just kind of in awe. I'm like, oh yes, yes, it's so beautiful. Yes, the space. Yes, recording it. Like, I need to take a moment. But yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I just another thing also what you were saying too about um the absurdity of the scene as well, of like finding the absurdity as well, and how I don't know, I think the way that you write about grief is so kind of multifaceted and multi-layered. And one of the things that really struck me, which is another scene that made me both laugh and cry at the same time, speaking of all the complexities, is the last section of the book, which is one of the most moving and also kind of funny in a lot of ways too, and tender, in which the narrator kind of resurrects her father by imagining him alive. And that section uses the hypothetical tense of would. And there's just something so beautiful and reparative about thinking about, I don't know, what's possible and ending with that kind of like future tense, hypothetical tense. And I feel like in a lot of the way we traditionally talk about grief, is like we talk about those left behind rather than like people that we continue imagining for. And I feel like this book does not leave any of its dead behind, and it presents something entirely different. This idea that we bring those we have lost into our futures, and that they continue to have a future alongside us. And that was just like tremendously moving to me. So I was just wondering, how did you decide to end the novel on this section that has this different tense and different structure to it? Because it feels a little bit different from the other vignettes in the book. Yeah, I would just love to hear your thought process behind that. Yeah.
Yeah, that is the most beautiful question. I think that what I realized in my own experience of grief is that just because someone dies, it doesn't mean the relationship ends.
Mm-hmm.
And the relationship can keep changing and growing. It's not what I would have expected. And yeah, it felt very joyful to write the ending in the hypothetical tense and be able to imagine for the narrator and her family all the things that they could do together. Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about how it felt joyful to write about it in this way, and also this idea of having a continuing relationship. And it also made me think a lot of the vignette in the book where talking about like the narrator is talking about forgiving her father, and there's an entire conversation about forgiveness. And I just thought it was so beautiful and interesting. Again, like this idea of a continual living relationship, to those we have lost. And yeah, I just was interested in, yeah, how you, I don't know, how you wrote those vignettes that kind of, yeah, were about relationships to, okay, sorry, this is like very scattered, but like relationships to, that's, okay, this is, I'm sorry, I'm getting like very, I don't know quite how to articulate it, but maybe just hearing about your thought process behind that vignette on forgiveness and like what it means to write those relationships with those who are already passed, but then have those continuing conversations. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're being such an amazing conversation partner. Um, hmm. I think I feel like the thing that I want to say is like grief, or like everyone grieves differently, and I feel like even the same person will grieve differently for different loved ones.
Mm,
So I didn't want to write a book where I really went into the like specifics and interior of the narrator's grief. Um, it was more important for me to create this space, and I hope it was like a big space where readers could bring their own experiences and feel their own emotions and draw their own connections. And my big wish was to write a book that is a space for people to grieve when they're reading it. So for a lot of those scenes, I really I didn't go into the interiority. I didn't like want to show that. I just wanted to leave it unsaid.
Wow, I really love that idea of a book as a space and of wanting to create space. I feel like that's such a, I don't know, I've never thought of something of a book in that way before, but I think it's totally true. And I love this idea of the reader kind of bringing their own interiority to the book as well. And it not just being about the narrator's um, process of grieving as well, but thinking about space made for the reader. That is so generous and so beautiful, and I love that idea so much. And it also makes me think of, I don't know, how the book in some ways, like rather than going into that interiority, we get a lot of descriptions of rituals that are kind of collective, or the idea of prayer or ritual. I'm thinking also of like one of my favorite scenes as well is the description of the narrator mother performing a hair ceremony. And I just love that there's a kind of collective space making happening in the books through these rituals as well. And I was just interested in what drew you to writing about various rituals around grief and death and what, and like marriage and and life too. Yeah, and how you approach kind of like thinking about the collective, and not just the narrator. Yeah.
It's actually kind of surprising to look at the book on hindsight and realize, oh my gosh, yeah, there are so many rituals throughout the book. But as you said, because there are funerals, there's funerals and there's a wedding, all these really big life events. I feel like there's so many rituals that just go along with them, and it's just like a way for these characters to grieve also, and to celebrate. And yeah, I mean, for those, I definitely drew a lot from my own experience of rituals that my family practice. And um, yeah.
But yeah, I just think it's so interesting that you were also talking about, like, in relation to interiority, at least reading, like, those rituals became a form of interiority for me, for the characters, and for the family as well. And so entering the space of ritual, I don't know, it felt like this collective interiority. Is there such thing as collective interiority? I'm not sure, but it definitely really felt that way. Um, yeah, and it's also really interesting to hear about how like one common thread of this conversation is like not knowing what you're writing about until like until you have a certain kind of hindsight, or not knowing what the book is about until you have that space of hindsight. And I would just love to know, like, what are the things that you're discovering about the book now, and what is it like to have this relationship with the book, that is not just entirely your own anymore?
Wow. I don't know if I've like processed it yet because it just came out today and it feels really surreal. I didn't go to any bookstores today, so I wasn't able to see it on any tables or shelves yet. Hmm. I think it just feels like my current feeling about the book is just like just so much fulfillment that like this thing that I set out to do 7 years ago that I thought at multiple points along the way would never happen. That now it's like here I have like several copies like I'm hearing some like super touching feedback. Yeah, I think that if there's anything I've learned from the process, it's just like it's so important for me to trust my intuition and like not worry about whether something is going to work out or whether it's going to be understood. So much of the process was this intuitively guided, like step by step for years type of journey. And like at so many points along the way, I really wanted to know what it was going to look like at the end, but there was no way. And so I feel like now that I've published one book, that's something I'll try to remind myself for whenever I start my next project, that it's just like trusting my intuition and like it's just taking one step at a time and not like bringing in my inner critic too early.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I really love this idea of the book being a kind of future touchstone for you as well, and imagining this book as and continuing with you. And yeah, I'm really interested in hearing, and this is, I guess, somewhat related to one of the audience questions, but I guess in the midst of not knowing what it would become or what it would look like or who would read it or things like that, like what kept you tethered to this project over 7 years?
Wow. Probably just that I enjoyed it. Like I feel like if there's anything that I've learned about myself and my writing process is just like joy and pleasure are the best motivations more than any kind of like feeling that I should or imposing. I mean, I tried everything along the way from like daily word counts to weekly like page counts or whatever. And I just feel like at the end of the day, like just having just this interest, joy, and pleasure in the process of it because it takes so long. Not that it was like that, like all the time. Of course, it was really hard and so many moments where I doubted myself. But yeah, it just felt like I felt really rewarded and satisfied in writing the book.
Wow, I love this idea of being guided by joy and pleasure and that being the tether. I think that's so beautiful. And really, yeah, really it's something I also really needed to hear, I think. So thank you for that. Thank you. I'm now going to intersperse a few audience questions into our conversation, and we'll continue this conversation as well. I'd love to hear, and again, feel free, anyone in the audience, to use the Q&A. But I really love this question from Allison. You are sensitive to the subtleties of domestic life. Could could you describe a setting, a place in the home, lighting, smell, snack sounds that you might imagine for your readers as they experience your book? Oh, that's so interesting. I also agree that you are very sensitive to the subtleties of domestic life and setting. Yeah.
Sorry, could I describe?
Describe a setting, a place in the home, lighting, smell, snack, sounds that you might imagine for your readers as they experience your book. Wow, I've never thought about that before, but
Allison, hi, Allison. It's so interesting that you're asking about like all these sensory details because a big part of my writing this book is actually to not have very many sensory details, because I wanted to create this feeling of rootlessness and the rootlessness that the narrator felt. And so it's really only at certain parts of the book where I include like one or two of these sensory details. Yeah. So that's how I'm gonna answer that question.
No, that I love that idea so much of wanting to, of the lack of sensory details being this very purposeful and intentional choice, because I feel like typically the way we talk about writing is like, oh, the more sensory details, the more grounded the reader should be and the more you can orient them. And I really like this idea that it's the opposite. It is about a form of rootlessness and kind of not orienting in a way. But I think that like there are some really interesting textures happening as well, like thinking about the green carpet that the narrator rubs her hands on, or one of the ones I remember is also like the Lay's potato chips, as like crunching in the snack that the narrator's grandmother prepares for her. So when you did choose to use those specific sensory details, was it because you were trying to? Oh no, I'm just curious to hear about like when you made the choice to include those. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that because it's a book about memory as well and grief, and I feel like when we think back to our memories, it's not like we have this high res. I mean, maybe some people photographic memory do, but most of us don't have this like high res image or video of everything that happened. So there's like, I try to include like one or two here and there that would feel salient or have some kind of emotional resonance for the narrator. Like especially with food, because food was in many ways kind of this form of love in the family.
Yeah.
So just like remembering the flavors and textures and smells of food from childhood, those are like things that I wanted to include in terms of sensory details.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because it's not just food, which I do think is really important, but it's also interesting to think about like the mentions of like the grocery stores, Yaohan, and like mall food courts, like these spaces, I don't know, that represent community, I think, and that represent like kind of the center. Like I really love the description too of like what grocery stores are in the area and no longer going to Chinatown. Like I just think it's really interesting to like relate to place through food as well. Um, but I would love to hear I guess this is now maybe partially transitioning into a future activity, which is actually about food. But I would love to hear more about um, was food some like kind of a conscious thing that you knew you were interweaving throughout? And not just food, but also like the mention of the restaurant later too, like the Spanish restaurant in one of the vignettes that was also really like that really stuck with me. Or was it again something that happened more intuitively and unconsciously?
Yeah, it was definitely more intuitive and unconscious in the beginning. But it also just like made sense to me because I love food and I like spend so much of my free time just like reading about food online and like cooking and talking to people about food, that it felt very natural that it crept in as a recurring uh, topic. Yeah, yeah, did I answer your question? No.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many facets. Like another part where I was thinking about food is when the grandmother describes like the broken rice bits in the oral history section. I was just like, oh my God, just the amount of, I don't know, there are just so many different, really interesting like relationships to food and like how we choose to remember things, with food being like another access point into a memory. Like I remember when you're talking about like approaching a scene and all those different kind of access points, it just made me think of that as well. But we just got another audience question that I am also dying to know, which is what were some of the literary influences on the novel, or particular writers or books, or your literary lineage? I'm also very interested in this question.
Ooh. Well, I already mentioned Alice Munro's stories. I think her voice was really formative for me. Um, A Feather on the Breath of God by Sigrid Nunez is such an important book for me. It's just such a beautiful coming of age novel, and um, there's kind of like a dreamy quality to it that I felt as well. I also read in the early stages of writing my book, I also read the poetry collection The Father by Sharon Olds, um, which is so beautiful. And I am, well, as you know, K-Ming, I'm a big fan of Sheila Heti.
Yes, yes.
I just think she's so formally inventive. Um, and also The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros, which I included in my epigraph. That was just an important model for me as well.
I love I can see all of these different literary influences on this book as well. I mean, I wanted to ask about the epigraph as well. Oh, but before that, I wanted to say I remember that you recommended me A Feather in the Breath of God, like as one of the first books that you recommended to me, and I read it. And I think what also is a kind of similarity between your writing and that book as well is like how carefully observed it is. Like I just feel like there's a real the narrator is very like attuned to seeing and observing different things, and I thought, yeah, it was really incredible. But anyway, I would love to hear more. That was one of the questions I wanted to ask too, is about the epigraph. Yeah, and how you arrived at it, and again, whether it was, I'm just also really interested to hear how writers discover their epigraphs, and how, like at what point in the process it I don't know, it arises. I'm just super interested. Yeah.
Yeah, for a really long time, I thought that I wasn't going to have an epigraph. And I remember talking to you about it and asking you how you found your epigraph for bestiality. Um, and I kind of just was of this mindset where, like, okay, if I don't find a good epigraph, then I'd rather not have an epigraph.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't, for a long time, I wasn't able to find one. And then finally, I think I was at, either the copy editing, it must be at the copy editing stage because it was before proofs were out. During the copy editing stage, I was like, okay, this is my kind of like my last chance.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this thought, which was that during the experience of revising this book, I realized that like it's so important for me to like do everything intuitively, and I didn't want to like force anything, and I didn't want to like, I kind of had this like ideal of like it being this like easygoing effortless process, even though it wasn't like all the time obviously. So I was like, okay, if I were like continuing with this like effortless approach, I would just go to my bookshelf and take a book out. And because every book that I read, I if there are passages that I like, I underline them in pencil and then I put a sticky flag. So I just remember that one day I went to my bookshelf and I was like, oh, The House on Mango Street. Like, that's the book written in vignettes. And it's a coming of age novel about a woman who dreams of becoming a writer or an artist, and is thinking so much about home. Like, it's so, like, so many similar themes. And I looked up to this book so much. And I pulled down, there were 2 page flags. And the first one was like not a good epigraph. And then the second one was I put it down on paper, and the ghost does not ache so much,
Yeah.
which I saw it and I was like, it has the word ghost. It has the word ghost. I feel like it's the perfect epigraph.
No, I think it's so perfect. Not just, I think, because it mentions ghosts, but this book does feel like, I don't know, a record in so many ways. Like there's just something about, I don't know. I remember that there's this there was this really beautiful review of your book on Entropy magazine, and I'm so sorry I'm forgetting the author right now, but I will find it. But like writing about how in those empty spaces, it's almost like these places to pull forward these stories, and how they're not like empty spaces. And I don't know, that's just what it made me think of as well, of like drawing things out of the page. And I don't know, but it fits so beautifully and really perfectly. And yeah, I also love like hearing about the relationship to House on Mango Street as like a book in vignettes, and like about becoming an artist in a lot of ways, because I think something that maybe we both have in common is like being drawn to the vignette structure. And I'm just interested to hear about yeah, your relationship to vignettes. Has it always been vignettes? Will it always be vignettes? That's probably too much of a too much of a question.
Who knows what
Yeah.
the future will bring, but I just started writing in vignettes when I started writing seriously, which was back in art school 7 years ago. And because it had this kind of circular quality, and because it felt like feels like this kind of short spurt of writing that is intuitive and circular, I really gravitated toward this form. I mean, later on hindsight, I could see that, these vignettes being fragmented, it really suits this book that's about grief and memory. And it also allowed me to kind of play with the order of them, and the emotional kind of fluctuations. I don't know if I will continue to write in vignettes. It feels very natural to me, but I also just don't know what I'm working on next.
Yeah, I don't really know what compelled me to ask if you will always forever write in vignettes. Like, where did that come from? I have no idea. Like, yes, tell me. I must know. We all must know. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. But also, I really love the way that you describe a vignette as circular. I've never thought about it in that way, but I think you're right. Like, there is something about it that allows, I feel like, for circling and for not having to like reach somewhere that feels really artificial, which I think goes along with what you were saying about like it the process of the book itself being this kind of intuitive, not knowing what it will become. Like I feel like the vignette is like the micro version of doing that on a grander scale. I had one more question that popped into my head as you were speaking, and then I started speaking and it like flew out of my brain.
That happens to me all the time.
Yeah, I was like something about oh, it reminds me. Okay, this is what what I wanted to ask. There's a moment in the book that also describes like the how, well, I guess also what a vignette is kind of like warping of like light on film, like creating like an effect on something. And I don't know, I just really like that these vignettes almost I don't know, like they've been kind of exposed to time in that feeling, and so what remains is very intentional and purposeful. Also reminds me of like the sections about like archiving artist work that survives. It feels like these vignettes have survived. But anyway, that was just a comment. I feel like we can have one more question before we have to transition out. Oh no, there's 1 minute left. I'm like, oh my God. um, but, oh, okay, I know what the question is going to be. So I got interviewed by a very kind person named Brian Lynn who asked me this question. And I was like, oh, this is so perfect. I want to ask everyone this question, which is, what is one thing that you love unconditionally about this book? I know, isn't this such a beautiful question? So perfect for what this book is about. But yes, that'll be my last question.
Wow. I would have to go with I love the space in the book. And especially because there was a time when I reformatted it so that there wasn't all that empty space on the pages. It felt like I really like kind of stuck to my gut feeling, and and held on to that part, that quality that has been with the writing since the beginning. Yeah, I would say that I love the space in the book unconditionally.
Oh, I'm so moved. Thank you. I also love the space in the book as well. And thank you. I just feel like there are so many things in this conversation I want to carry with me forever in terms of like intuition, and joy and pleasure guiding us through the writing process. So thank you so much for conversing with me. I will now pass it on to the next amazing portion of the program.
Oh my gosh, I just also want to thank you, K-Ming. You are just such an inspiration to me, and thank you for being my conversation partner tonight, for asking all these really thoughtful questions, and just being such a caring friend. I am so grateful that you agreed to launch my first book with me, and it's just been so wonderful. So thank you. And I also want to thank the Asian American Writers Workshop for being the first place to publish my story, for being the first fellowship to accept me. The workshop opened all the doors for me, and I'm just so grateful. It was at the workshop that I met my editor. Like, you made everything happen, so I'm really grateful.
I mean, we are so incredibly grateful to you, Pik-Shuen, to you, K-Ming. I'm so grateful for your work, for this conversation. I'm feeling actually so moved by your last question, K-Ming, too. I love that ending on unconditional love of the book that you wrote. I have a couple of closing notes of this section, and K-Ming and Pik-Shuen are actually going to duck off of camera for a moment, but please do stay with us. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes after I'm done talking with our virtual after party. There will be a cooking demonstration with Chef Eric Huang. So please do stay online with us for another half hour or so. I always end these events just sort of calling for a round of virtual applause in the chat for Pik-Shuen, to congratulate her on her publication day, but also for K-Ming for guiding us through such a beautiful conversation. I want to thank everyone who joined us online, who spent your Tuesday evenings with us. We're so grateful that you shared this space. And yeah, I want to thank our incredible ASL interpreters from Pro Bono ASL, Annie and Chris. Thank you so much for helping us make this event accessible. I want to thank our event partners at Books Are Magic, Tables of Contents, and Pecking House. My colleague just posted in the chat. If you scroll up a little bit, you can find a link to purchase K-Ming and Pik-Shuen's books. This event was recorded, or it is still being recorded. It'll be available shortly on our YouTube channel. If you would like to revisit the conversation, share it with friends, loved ones, etc. And then a couple of upcoming AAWW events, just very quickly. So later this month, on July 26th, we are so excited to launch the Margins Notebook, Queer Time, which is a collection of queer contemporary Taiwanese literature. This is a bilingual event in Chinese and English with subtitles. You'll be able to watch on our YouTube channel. On August 3rd, we are super excited to welcome Nawaz Ahmed and Kazim Ali to discuss Nawaz's debut novel, Radiant Fugitives. This was just longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, I believe earlier today, and we can't wait to celebrate with Nawaz and Kazim. That is all of the announcements that I have. I will remain on screen, but Eric and Pik-Shuen, please do let us know when you are ready to go. And I do want to mention actually very quickly, the recipe that Eric is cooking this evening was inspired by Pik-Shuen's memories. They can talk a little bit more about this. It was inspired specifically by the book, and the recipe is available on the Tables of Contents website. We will post a link in the chat so you can follow this recipe later on as well.